She didn't scream when she found it. She just stood in the middle of her dead husband's barn, holding a saddle that didn't belong to Thomas, leather too light, stitching too new. The left stirrup replaced by someone who'd never watched Thomas Bellamy ride a single day in his life, and she understood, with the cold clarity of a woman who had spent 2 years grieving an accident, that there had been no accident at all. Someone had murdered her husband, and that someone had been standing at her funeral, weeping. If this story shook something loose in your chest, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. Stay with me, because what happens next will change everything. Clara Bellamy had learned that grief had a sound, not the sound of weeping. Not the sound of a shovel striking frozen Montana earth. Those sounds came early and then faded, the way a bell fades. You hear the ring, then the diminishing, then the silence that proves the bell was real. No, the sound of grief that lasted was quieter than that. It was the sound of a town deciding you were finished. It was Mrs. Hargrove dropping her voice to a murmur when Clara passed the dry goods store, not even bothering to finish dropping it before Clara was fully past. It was the sound of chairs shifting at the church social, not pulled away. Nothing so honest as that, just eased back a few inches, creating a geography of exclusion so subtle you couldn't point to it but couldn't mistake it either. It was the sound of men clearing their throats and locating something fascinating to examine on the middle distance when Clara Bellamy walked into a room. Because Clara Bellamy was a widow, and not in the estimation of Willow Creek, Montana Territory, the sympathetic kind. She was 29 years old. She was a beautiful woman whose body was large and full, and entirely her own, wide through the hips, heavy through the shoulders, built the way frontier women were sometimes built when they'd spent their lives doing actual work. She had dark eyes that missed very little and a mouth that in happier times had laughed easily. She had loved one man and buried him 2 years past, and had been working herself nearly to the bone ever since to hold on to everything he'd left her. The town's verdict on her situation had been delivered slowly, in pieces, in the particular way small frontier communities delivered verdicts they were too polite to state outright. She had been lucky once to find Thomas. She would not be lucky again. A widow in her condition, that was the phrase Margaret Hollis used. Condition, as though grief were a disease, and Clara's body were the symptom, ought to accept the circumstances God had assigned her and find a smaller, quieter life somewhere she wouldn't strain anyone's charity. Clara had not accepted this verdict. Every morning she rose before sunrise and worked until her hands ached. She hauled water and mended fence and tended the small cattle herd she'd fought to keep through 2 brutal Montana winters. She took in sewing from 3 ranching families and sold her salt-crusted cornbread at the feed store on Fridays. She was not comfortable, she was not easy, but she was surviving on her own land with her own 2 hands, and she had wrapped that fact around herself like armor. The mornings were the hardest, not because of the labor. Clara had never been afraid of labor. But because Thomas's absence had texture in the mornings, the precise shape of him in the bed, the particular sound of his boots on the kitchen floorboards, the way he held his coffee with both hands on cold days. Thomas Bellamy had been the only man in her life who had looked at all of her and seen something worth keeping without reservation. A person's worth isn't measured by what others see first, he used to tell her. He'd believed it the way decent men believe things, not as a philosophy to announce, but as a fact so obvious it barely needed saying. Without him, it was harder to make the fact hold. She was working a split rail section at the north end of her fence on a Tuesday morning in late June when she heard a horse slow on the road behind her. She didn't look up. She'd developed the careful indifference of a woman who'd learned that acknowledging strangers only invited their opinions. "That rail's been fighting you a while," a voice said. She looked up. The man on the horse was around 36, sitting the saddle the way men sit it when they've spent more of their lives on horseback than off. Dark hair with gray working in at the temples, a jaw that suggested he'd developed opinions somewhere along the way and wasn't in the habit of apologizing for them. He was watching her with an expression she didn't immediately recognize. It wasn't pity, It wasn't the evaluating look men gave women they were deciding whether to approach. It wasn't the careful blankness of someone trying not to notice her body. He was watching her the way you watch someone do a thing that interests you. "The rail's been fighting me for 2 years," Clara said. It came out more honest than she'd intended. "May I?" He nodded at the fence. She stepped back, watched him examine it, running his hands along the split with the attention of someone who actually wanted to understand the problem. "It's not the rail," he said. "It's the post. Post shifted in the winter freeze. The rail looks like the problem, but it's following what the post already did." Clara stared at the post. A slow private heat moved through her. She had been fighting that rail for months and had never thought to look 12 inches to the left. "I would have figured that out," she said. "I know," he said. No condescension, no amusement, just a statement of fact. "You were getting there." He stood and looked at her directly. "Ethan Caldwell. I've taken over the Harmon place 3 miles east." "Clara Bellamy. I know. Willow Creek isn't a town that keeps quiet about much." "What have they told you about me?" she asked. She'd learned to ask this directly. "Better to know what you were working against." "Enough," he said, "to make me think they don't know you at all." Clara looked at him, trying to locate the angle. There was always an angle. "Mr. Caldwell," she said carefully, "I appreciate you stopping. But I should tell you something, before this goes any further." "All right." She made herself hold his gaze. The only way to control a conversation you were afraid of was to not look away from it. "I can't," she said. He frowned. "Can't what?" "I'm a widow." She said it the way she always said it, warning and wall and conclusion, all at once. 2 years now, and I am not in any position." She stopped. She wasn't entirely sure what she was warning him against. Only that something about this man standing at her fence made her want to step back before she accidentally stepped forward. He was quiet for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. "Good," he said. Clara blinked. "Good means I won't have to duel anyone for you." The laugh came out before she could catch it, real and undignified and startled, the kind she hadn't produced in so long that the sound of it surprised even her. She pressed her hand to her mouth. Ethan was watching her with an expression she still couldn't name. Not triumph, not the smirk of a man who'd landed a clever line and knew it. Something quieter and more careful than that. He turned back to the fence. "The post needs replacing," he said. "I have extra timber at my place if you want it." "I'll pay for it," Clara said immediately. "I know you will." He remounted, tipped his hat simple, nothing theatrical about it, and rode east. Clara stood at the broken fence for a long moment after the sound of hooves faded. Her hand was still near her mouth. She was still feeling the unfamiliar weight of that laugh, like a muscle she'd forgotten she had. She told herself it meant nothing. She was very practiced at that. The timber arrived the next morning, delivered by one of Ethan's hands without ceremony. There was a note with it, brief, practical, nothing personal. The correct nail length for Montana's freeze-thaw cycle. Clara read it twice, then repaired the fence post herself in under an hour. Correctly, the first time. She didn't see him for 4 days. When she did, it was at Joseph Crane's Mercantile on Friday morning. She'd come to sell cornbread and collect thread. He was at the counter debating a supply order discrepancy with the controlled patience of a man accustomed to winning arguments without raising his voice. Clara had intended to conduct her business and leave. She didn't get the chance. "Clara, dear." Margaret Hollis materialized at her elbow with 2 of her companions, women of that particular Willow Creek variety who cultivated their goodness so publicly that it functioned as social leverage. Margaret took Clara's arm with that too gentle grip. "We were just speaking about you. The Henderson family up in Helena, Mr. Henderson's brother is looking for a housekeeper. A good position. Steady work. You'd be comfortable." Clara kept her voice pleasant. "I have work." "Oh, but Clara." Margaret's tone was padded with sympathy the way a trap is padded with grass. "Managing a ranch alone in your situation, it's such a burden on you." And it's not as though she stopped. Let the pause do the work her words couldn't. "Not as though what?" Clara asked. The 2 companions exchanged a look. "We only want what's best for you," the taller one said. Then you'll respect that I know what that is, Clara said. She heard the social register shift and recalibrate, the slight held breath of women recalculating how hard to push. Mrs. Bellamy. Ethan's voice from the direction of the counter. Casual as a change in weather, everyone looked at him. He walked toward her with the unhurried certainty of a man who'd already decided he belonged in the space he was moving through. I was hoping I'd run into you, he said, like it was the most natural thing. I need your opinion on something. The south pasture drainage situation at my place. You've worked this county's soil longer than anyone else I've spoken to. I'd value your thinking on it. He said it without performance. Not the elaborate deference of a man trying to appear enlightened. Just a man asking a woman for information he actually wanted. Margaret Hollis's mouth was slightly open. I can come by Wednesday, Clara said after a beat. I appreciate it. He bought his supplies and left. The mercantile was quiet in a way that felt meaningfully different from the silence before it. Margaret did not finish her sentence. On Wednesday, Clara rode out to the Caldwell place and walked the south pasture for the better part of 2 hours. Ethan listened when she spoke with the focused attention of someone actually processing what was being said. When he disagreed with her drainage channel assessment, he said so and gave his reasons clearly, and when she countered, he reconsidered and said so. She couldn't remember the last time a man had disagreed with her, like she was a person worth disagreeing with. You know horses, he said, as they headed back toward the house. My father ran a livery stable in Missouri. I grew up reading horses before I read books. That bay mare by the fence, the one favoring her right foreleg. Clara went to her without thinking. The mare came to her with the uncomplicated trust animals gave people who'd spent years learning their language. Clara ran both hands down the foreleg with practiced care. Stone bruise, she said. Not new. Whoever rode her wasn't watching. Previous owner. I just acquired her. What would you do? Rest in soft ground for 2 weeks. Warm poultice twice a day. She'll come sound. Thank you, he said. No elaborate gratitude. No performance of being impressed. On the ride home, Clara tried to locate the angle. There had to be one. Men didn't simply pay attention without wanting something on the other end of it. But she couldn't find it, and she found that more unsettling than the alternatives. The days built a pattern she recognized before she meant to. Ethan stopped at her fence in the morning, sometimes never lingering, never pressing for more than she offered. He brought genuine questions about the county and the soil and the particular personalities of Willow Creek's merchants, and he listened to the answers. Once he appeared without warning, because a section of her north fence had come down in a night storm, and he'd seen it from the road. I didn't ask for help, she said, meeting him at the break. No, you didn't. He picked up the wire. There's a difference. They worked in silence for a while. The comfortable kind, which was the most troubling kind, because Clara had not expected to find comfort in any man's company, and she hadn't prepared a defense against it. Ethan, she said his name without deciding to. Were you married before? He didn't flinch from it. Yes, 7 years ago, Texas. Fever. He paused. Her name was May. She would have loved Montana. Clara nodded. Does it get easier, she asked. Not the grief. The way a town decides what you are afterward. The way they reassign your life without asking. Some of it gets easier. He looked at the wire in his hands. The part that gets easier is when you stop measuring their version of you against your own. How long did that take? Longer than I'd like to tell you. Clara turned that over. People here have decided I'm finished, she said. First time she'd said it out loud to anyone. They're very kind about it. That's nearly the worst part, all that kindness. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, what does Garrett Bellamy want from your land? The shift was so abrupt that Clara looked at him sharply. What do you know about Garrett? I've been here 2 months. His interest in your property isn't quiet. He mentions it to people. Clara's jaw tightened. He wants the ranch, she said. He always believed it should have come to him instead of Thomas. And since Thomas is gone, she stopped. And since you're a widow, nobody's likely to fight for, Ethan quietly. The words landed with surgical precision. He thinks the easiest path runs straight through me. He doesn't know you. It wasn't a question. No, Clara said. He doesn't. She reached for another length of wire. He came to my door 2 days after the funeral, she said. 2 days. With a document he wanted me to sign, said it was to protect my interests, wanted me to transfer management of the northern pasture to a trust he'd control. What did you do? I told him to get off my porch. She pulled the wire taut. He's been less friendly since then. Ethan attached his end and held it firm while she fastened it. There's something I need to ask you, he said. About Thomas. About the accident, he paused. I won't ask it if you're not ready. Clara went still. The wind came off the Rockies and moved through the grass around them. A hawk turned slow circles above the north pasture. Ask it, she said. Ethan turned to face her. Thomas's horse, he said. Tom Hadley at the livery mentioned it to me when I was looking at stock. Said something always bothered him about it. A horse that's been in a genuine wreck comes home lathered, half-crazed, if it comes home at all. Thomas's horse came back at a walk, calm like it'd been watered and turned loose. Clara didn't speak. The saddle, Ethan continued, watching her face. I looked at the saddle in your barn last week. I hope you'll forgive me for that. The left stirrup leather had been replaced. Recent work. Different weight than the right side. Thomas never used that leather, Clara said. Her voice was very quiet. I noticed it before the funeral. I didn't. I couldn't. She stopped. Someone handled that saddle after Thomas did, Ethan said. Someone who didn't know his equipment well enough to match it exactly. The cold knowledge moved through her slowly, the way water moves through cracked stone, finding every seam, filling every hollow. She had known, not the way you know a fact you've confirmed, but the way your body knows something, before your mind can make a sentence out of it. She had known since the week after the funeral, when she'd gone to the barn alone and stood with the saddle in her hands and felt something wrong about it, that she couldn't name and couldn't afford to pursue. She had locked that knowledge in a room inside herself because she had not been able to survive Thomas's death and the investigation of it at the same time. She had chosen survival. Now survival was asking for something different. Garrett, she said. The word came out flat and certain. And said, I don't have proof. Not yet. But you believe it. He looked at her directly. I believe your husband's death deserves a harder look than it got, he said. And I believe you deserve the truth about what happened on that land. Whatever the truth is, Clara stood with the cold and the wind and the hawk still turning overhead, and she felt something change in her chest, not break, because nothing fragile was left to break. Something harder than that. Something that had been folded small for 2 years of survival and was slowly, carefully, beginning to open. There's more, she said. Ethan waited. The week before Thomas died, he came home from town and he was quiet. The way he got quiet when something was wrong that he hadn't worked out how to say yet. She set down the wire. I asked him what it was. He said he'd found some papers in the county records office. Something about the northern land boundary. He said Garrett had been making inquiries he had no business making. She paused. He said he was going to confront Garrett about it. I asked him not to go alone. Did he go alone? Clara's throat moved. He went the next morning, she said, to the northern property. Alone. She looked up. He never came back. The silence between them had changed quality entirely. Those papers he found, Ethan said. Did he bring them home? I looked, Clara said, after the funeral. I tore that house apart looking. They weren't there. Someone took them. Someone had to have. Ethan turned to look north, toward the boundary where Thomas Bellamy had ridden one morning and not ridden back. Who else knew Thomas had found those records, he asked. He would have told his foreman, Samuel Whitaker. Clara frowned. Samuel worked for us for 6 years. I always trusted him. But after Thomas died, he left Willow Creek inside a month. I never heard where he went. Ethan looked at her sharply. A man who'd worked 6 years for a family leaves within a month of the husband's death. I told myself he needed a fresh start, that the grief was too close. Or someone paid him to go, Ethan said. The hawk overhead had found its thermal and was riding it high, growing small and smaller. We need those land records, Clara said. Her voice had steadied into something she recognized, the same voice she used when she was deciding a thing, not weighing it. "And we need to find Samuel Whitaker." "Yes," Ethan said. "I'm not asking you to do this for me," she said, quickly. "Clearly, I'm not a woman who needs a man to fight her battles." "I know that. Then why are you still standing here?" Ethan looked at her with that expression she'd been failing to name since the first morning at the fence. She could name it now. It was the look of a man who recognized something valuable and was not going to be foolish enough to walk away from it. "Because Thomas Bellamy deserves the truth," he said. "And because you are the only person in this county with enough courage and enough sense to find it." He picked up his tools. "And because," he added, not quite looking at her, "I made a habit a long time ago of standing beside people worth standing beside." Clara Bellamy stood in her north pasture in the summer of 1886, and she felt the room inside herself, the one she'd locked and bolted and bricked over, begin, very slowly, to open. It was not hope, not yet. It was something older than hope and harder to kill. It was the particular stubbornness of a woman who had been told her story was over and had decided quietly and completely that it was not. But 3 miles away, in the front room of the Bellamy land office that Garrett had taken over the month after the funeral, telling Clara it was just to manage paperwork, a man who had been watching Clara's north pasture with a spyglass for the past 20 minutes slowly lowered it. He'd seen Ethan Caldwell at the fence. He'd seen them talking. He'd seen the way Clara stood when the conversation shifted, that small straightening, that change in the set of her shoulders that told a man who'd been watching her for 2 years that something had changed. Garrett Bellamy set down the spyglass on his desk beside a stack of land documents with Thomas Bellamy's name on them and folded his hands. "Well," he said quietly to the empty room, "that's a problem." Garrett Bellamy did not wait long. Clara found out about it the next morning, before she'd finished her first cup of coffee, when 14-year-old Danny Crane Joseph's youngest boy, who ran errands for half the town in exchange for penny candy, and the feeling of importance came banging on her door, with the particular urgency of a child who'd been told something was secret and therefore couldn't possibly keep it. "Mrs. Bellamy." He was breathing hard. "Mr. Garrett Bellamy was at my papa's store this morning before opening. Real early. I was sweeping the back porch and I heard him through the wall." Clara set down her coffee. "What did he say, Danny?" "He was asking my papa about Mr. Caldwell, about where he came from and why he bought the Harmon place and whether he had entanglements in the county." Danny frowned at the word like it tasted strange. "Papa said he didn't know. Mr. Garrett said that was fine, that he'd find out himself. Then he said something else." "What?" Danny hesitated. "He said, a man who spends time at a widow's fence either wants her land or her sympathy, and either way he's going to be disappointed." The boy looked up. "I didn't know what that meant exactly, ma'am, but it didn't sound friendly." "No," Clara said, "it wasn't meant to be." She pressed a coin into Danny's hand. "You did right telling me. Don't tell anyone else you came here." After the boy left, Clara stood in her kitchen for a long moment with her hands flat on the table. Garrett already knew about Ethan. He'd been watching. Which meant the conversation at the fence yesterday had been seen, and Garrett had processed it overnight and moved by dawn, which told her exactly how worried he was. A man who moves that fast is a man who has something to protect. She saddled her horse and rode 3 miles east before the morning had fully arrived. Ethan was already up, working the bay mare in the small corral behind the barn. When he saw Clara coming, he read her face before she'd said a word and came through the fence gate to meet her. "What happened?" he said. "Garrett knows we talked." She swung down. "He was at the mercantile before sunup asking questions about you. Asking about your background, whether you had connections in the county." She looked at him directly. "He called me a widow's fence." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "He's scared," he said. "Good, he should be. Scared men make fast moves, Clara." "Then we need to move faster." She tied her horse. "I've been thinking about Samuel Whitaker, Thomas's foreman. The one who left within a month of the funeral. What about him?" "I know where he went." Ethan looked at her, I told you last night I didn't know, she said. That was true then. But I went home and I went through Thomas's desk, the letters section, the bottom drawer, the one I haven't opened since he died. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket. Samuel wrote to me, 6 weeks after he left, from a town called Bridger, about 90 miles south. He said he was sorry for leaving so fast, that he hoped I understood. That he used this word exactly, obligations, required him to be elsewhere. Ethan took the letter and read it. Obligations, he said. A man who works for you 6 years and is sorry to leave doesn't use a word like obligations unless someone told him to use it, Clara said. That letter was written by a man who'd been paid to go and was trying to tell me something without being able to say it. Ethan folded the letter carefully and handed it back. I'll ride to Bridger, he said. We'll ride to Bridger, Clara said. He looked at her. I know this county doesn't think much of a widow riding 90 miles with a man she's known 6 weeks, she said. I don't particularly care what this county thinks. Ethan studied her face for a moment, then nodded once. Day after tomorrow, he said. I'll need 1 day to arrange for my hands to manage the stock. I'll be ready at first light. She was already turning back to her horse when he said her name. Clara. That bottom drawer, he said. Were there other papers in it? Anything that looked like it might be land documents or surveyor's records? She shook her head slowly. Just letters, personal things. Thomas kept his business records in the office. She stopped. Which Garrett has been managing for 14 months. They looked at each other. He's had 14 months to go through everything, Ethan said. Yes, Clara said, he has. The word everything sat between them with all its weight. She rode home. She spent that day and the next going through every piece of paper she had left in the house, every drawer, every box, every coat pocket she hadn't turned out since Thomas died. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. She knew only that Thomas had found something in the county records office the week before he died and had come home quiet with it, and a man as careful as Thomas didn't find something significant without copying it down somewhere. She found it on the second day, in the lining of Thomas's old Bible. Not the records themselves, but a page of Thomas' handwriting, his careful, precise hand, the hand he used for figures and contracts rather than letters. Numbers, land plot numbers, a surveyor's reference code she didn't recognize. And one name written at the bottom and underlined twice. Harlan Midge. Clara sat on the edge of the bed with the paper in her hands and tried to place the name. It took her a moment. Harlan Midge was a land agent. He worked out of the territorial capital. He represented mining interests specifically, the kind of large-scale mineral extraction operations that were moving north from Colorado following the silver finds. She thought about what Ethan had said, that Thomas had found papers about the northern land boundary, that Garrett had been making inquiries he had no business making. She thought about the northern pasture, the rocky, hard soil section that had always been the least productive part of the Bellamy Ranch. That Thomas had kept it because it completed the property line, not because it fed cattle. The kind of land, she thought slowly, that would be worthless for ranching and valuable for mining. She folded Thomas's page and put it in the same pocket as Samuel's letter. They left before dawn 2 days later. Clara told no one where she was going except Danny Crane, who she trusted only because he was 14 and loyal and had already proven he understood the difference between a secret and a lie. If Garrett Bellamy or anyone working for him asks where I've gone, she told the boy, you say I went to visit my cousin in Billings. You got a cousin in Billings, ma'am? No, Clara said. But Garrett doesn't know that. Danny grinned, yes, ma'am. The ride south was long and cold in the early hours, and warmer as the sun climbed, and they talked as people talk when they're covering distance together, not continuously, but in the natural rhythm of conversation that has room for silence. Clara told Ethan about Thomas's Bible and the page she'd found. She watched his face as he processed it. Harlan Midge, he said. I know that name. Clara looked at him sharply. You know him? I know of him. Back in Texas, there was a situation a rancher I knew, name of Prescott. Midge approached him about a mineral rights agreement on the back portion of his land. Prescott didn't understand what he was signing. When he figured it out 2 years later, the mining company had legal access to 30% of his water table. Ethan's jaw tightened. Prescott lost the whole ranch inside 4 years. Garrett was arranging the same thing, Clara said. It wasn't a question. Garrett arranged the introduction, Ethan said. And when Thomas found out and refused, he left the sentence where it was. Thomas was going to expose him, Clara said. He was going to go to Sheriff Brooks with the records, and Garrett couldn't. Her throat tightened. She made herself continue. Garrett couldn't let that happen. The land deal would have collapsed, and Garrett would have faced criminal charges for using Thomas's land without authority. Which gave him reason enough, Ethan said quietly. They rode in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that follows something that can't be unsaid. I keep thinking, Clara said eventually, about the morning he left. Thomas, she looked at the road ahead. I handed him his coffee. He kissed me on the forehead. He always kissed me on the forehead. Never the cheek like other men. Always the forehead, and he said, "I'll be back for supper, Claire." I said, "Don't be late." That was the last thing I ever said to my husband. Don't be late. Ethan said nothing. He didn't try to reframe it or soften it or turn it into something instructive. He just let it be what it was. After a moment, that silence itself was a kind of gift. They reached Bridger in the early afternoon. It was a smaller town than Willow Creek, 1 Main Street. A saloon, a feed store, a rooming house with a hand-painted sign that had weathered to near illegibility. Clara asked at the feed store whether anyone knew a man named Samuel Whitaker. The feed store owner, a short, barrel-chested man named Gus, looked at her with the particular wariness of a man who'd been asked questions before that turned out to have complicated answers. "Who's asking?" he said. "His former employer," Clara said. "Thomas Bellamy's widow. I have no grievance with Samuel. I only need to speak with him." Gus looked at Ethan. "He's with me," Clara said, before Ethan could speak. Something in her tone apparently settled the question. Gus jerked his chin toward the south end of the street. "Blue house at the end. He does repair work for folks out here. Keeps to himself." The house was small and neat in the way that spoke of a man making careful order out of a reduced life. Clara knocked. The man who opened the door had aged more than 2 years. Samuel Whitaker had always been lean, but now he was thin in the way that came from worry that had moved in permanently. His hair had gone more gray than she remembered. When he saw Clara, the color left his face entirely. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, just that, like a man who'd been expecting something to arrive and had never quite figured out what to do when it finally did. "Samuel," she said, "may we come in?" He stepped back. The three of them sat in Samuel's small front room. He didn't offer coffee. He sat with his hands between his knees and looked at the floor, and Clara gave him a moment with that, because she had learned what it looked like when a man was deciding whether to be honest. "I know why you're here," he said. "Then you can save us both the time of me asking," Clara said. Samuel looked up. He looked at Ethan, then back at Clara. "He told me not to say anything," he said, "Mr. Garrett Bellamy. He said if I stayed quiet and went away, he'd see to it I was set up comfortable somewhere. Said it was the cleanest way for everyone. And if you didn't stay quiet," Ethan said. Samuel's jaw moved. He didn't say that part directly. He didn't have to. Clara leaned forward. "Samuel, whatever Garrett promised you or threatened you with, that's between you and him. I'm not here to make your life harder. I'm here because my husband is in the ground, and I believe you know something about how he got there." Samuel Whitaker put his face in his hands. The room was very quiet. Then he lowered his hands, and he looked at Clara with the eyes of a man who'd been carrying something heavy for 2 years, and had finally been given permission to put it down. "I was there," he said, "on the northern property." That morning, Clara went completely still. "Tell me," she said. Samuel took a breath. Mr. Thomas rode out at first light. "I'd come up to check the fence line on the east boundary. It was my own initiative. He didn't know I'd be there. When I came around the north ridge, I saw Mr. Thomas's horse tied at the property marker. And I saw 2 men." He stopped. "Go on," Clara said. Her voice was absolutely steady. "Mr. Garrett was one of them. The other I didn't know, a big man, dressed like a hired hand but not one of ours. They were arguing. Mr. Thomas was telling Garrett that he had the documents, that he had proof of what Garrett had arranged with the land company, and that he was going to Sheriff Brooks that same day. Samuel swallowed. Garrett said the documents didn't prove anything. Thomas said they proved enough, and then Garrett said, he stopped again. Samuel, he said, those documents are going to disappear. And if you're not careful, Thomas, so are you. Clara pressed her lips together. What happened after that? Ethan said. I was afraid, Samuel said. I should have. I know I should have stayed. I know I should have ridden for the sheriff right then. But I was afraid and I rode back south, and I told myself it was just Garrett making threats, the way he always made threats, and nothing was going to come of it. He looked at Clara, and what was in his face was not quite guilt and not quite grief, but something that lived in the territory between them. And then they came and told us Mr. Thomas had a horse accident on the north property. And I knew. You knew it wasn't an accident, Clara said. Yes, ma'am, and you said nothing. He came to me that evening. At my bunkhouse, Samuel's hands tightened. He said he knew I'd been on the north property that morning. He said if I said one word, he'd tell Sheriff Brooks I had a hand in it. That no one would believe a ranch hand over a Bellamy. He said I'd hang. His voice had gone rough. I had a sister in Kansas City. 2 nephews. I wasn't brave enough. I'm sorry. I am more sorry than I have words for, Mrs. Bellamy. Clara sat with that for a long moment. She thought about Thomas. About the forehead kiss. About supper going cold on the stove. She thought about 2 years of grief she'd built on the foundation of a lie. Then she straightened her shoulders. Samuel, she said, I need you to write down everything you just told me. Exactly as you told it. Date and sign it. Samuel looked at her. If you do that, Ethan said, you take it to a federal marshal, not to Sheriff Brooks. We have reason to believe Brooks may have been complicit, even if only through deliberate blindness. He leaned forward. A federal marshal is outside Garrett's influence. And a signed affidavit from an eyewitness changes everything about what can be proved. Garrett will know it was me, Samuel said. Yes, Clara said. He will. She held Samuel's gaze. Samuel, I spent 2 years surviving. Just surviving. Getting through one day and then the next, telling myself the accident was just an accident because I couldn't carry the truth of it and keep moving at the same time. She paused. I'm done surviving. I want the truth, and I think you do too. I think you've wanted it for 2 years. I think that letter you sent me, obligations, I think you were trying to tell me something. Samuel looked at her for a long time. Then he got up and went to the small writing desk in the corner. I'll need paper, he said, and more than one copy. I have paper, Ethan said. Samuel wrote for nearly an hour. Clara and Ethan sat quietly while he did it, not watching over his shoulder, not pushing. When he was finished, he read it through once, signed it, and dated it. Then he looked up. The other man, he said, the one with Garrett that morning. I'd never seen him before, but I heard a name. Clara and Ethan both looked at him. Garrett called him Reddick, Samuel said. When Thomas's horse got skittish and pulled at the reins, Garrett said, Reddick, get that horse. That name stuck in my head because it's not a common one. Ethan sat forward very slightly. Reddick, he said. You know him? Clara asked. Ethan's expression had shifted to something careful and contained. I knew a man named Cal Reddick in Texas, he said slowly. He did hired work for a land speculator out of San Antonio. The kind of work a man doesn't put his name on. He paused. He left Texas ahead of a warrant about 3 years ago. Came north as far as anyone knew. The room was very quiet. Garrett imported him, Clara said. He didn't use a local man. He brought someone in, so there'd be no connection. Which means he planned it, Ethan said. It wasn't a confrontation that went wrong. It was arranged. The weight of that word arranged settled over the room like weather. Samuel put the signed pages on the table between them. What happens now? He said. Now, Clara said, picking up the documents with steady hands, we go home. She folded the pages carefully. the way Thomas used to fold his important papers twice lengthwise, once across, tucked into the breast pocket where they were closest to the body. "Samuel," she said, standing, "come back to Willow Creek." He stared at her. "You want me to come back? I want you where you're safe," she said. "And I want you where a federal marshal can reach you quickly when the time comes. Garrett has less power than he thinks he does, and a lot less than he's about to." She looked at him steadily. "You made a mistake 2 years ago. You're correcting it now. That matters." Samuel stood slowly. He was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Thomas used to say you were the strongest person he knew," he said. He said it regular. Said most people couldn't see it because they were too busy looking at the wrong things. His voice caught slightly. He was right. Clara pressed her hand briefly to Samuel's arm, not a long gesture, not a dramatic one, and walked to the door. They rode north as the afternoon tipped toward evening, the copies of Samuel's statement divided between them for safety, and the sky above the Montana plains turning that particular shade of amber that made the land look like it was lit from within. "You didn't tell me you knew who Reddick was before we left Willow Creek," Clara said. "I didn't know for certain until Samuel said the name," Ethan said. "And I didn't want to give you a direction before I had reason." Clara considered that. "Fair," she said. They rode a while in the fading light. "Thomas knew," she said quietly. "He knew when he rode out that morning that it wasn't safe. He'd been threatened the night before. He knew Garrett was dangerous." She paused. "He went anyway, because he believed what was right was worth doing even when it was dangerous." "He sounds like a man worth knowing," Ethan said. "He was the best man I've ever known," Clara said. Without apology, without the social hedging that women used when they praised their dead husbands in front of living men. Simply as a fact given its full weight. Ethan received it the way he received most things she said, without deflection, without discomfort. "He raised up a strong woman," he said. "He didn't raise me," Clara said. "He saw what was already there." Ethan looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly right." They were still 20 miles from Willow Creek when they saw the smoke. Not cook fire smoke, that thin domestic column that rose straight on a still evening. This was a rolling gray-black mass moving fast, carrying the particular smell of something larger than a hearth fire. Clara knew the direction before she'd consciously worked it out. She knew it the way you know things when the worst possibilities have already been living in your chest for weeks. "That's my property," she said. She kicked her horse to a gallop before Ethan could respond. She heard him come up fast beside her, both horses stretched out over the road, the signed copies of Samuel's affidavit pressed against her ribs inside her coat, and the smoke growing and growing against the evening sky. It was the barn, her barn where Thomas's tools still hung in the order he'd left them, where the bay mare had been stabled, where 2 years of her survival had been organized and stored and maintained through sheer bloody-mindedness was on fire. She was off her horse before it had fully stopped, running toward the structure, but the heat hit her 20 feet away like a physical wall, and Ethan caught her arm and held it. "The horses," she said. "The horses are in there." "They're not," said a voice. She turned. Danny Crane was standing at the edge of her yard, soot-gray and wild-eyed, gripping the lead ropes of 3 horses, including Clara's 2 barn animals, with both hands, and the expression of a boy who had done something terrifying and was only now beginning to understand he had done it. "I got them out," he said. "I saw the smoke from the road and I got them out before it caught fully. I tied them in your south pasture." He swallowed hard. "Mrs. Bellamy, I'm sorry. I tried to get to the tools too, but the smoke." "Danny." Clara crossed to him and gripped his face in both hands, the boy flinching, then going still. "You are the bravest 14-year-old in the Montana Territory. Do you hear me? The horses are what matters. You did right." The boy's eyes went glassy for a moment. Clara turned back to the barn. The structure was going to be a total loss. She could see that clearly. 2 years of careful storage, Thomas's tools, the winter hay reserves, all of it. But the horses were alive. The documents were on her person. And there was a signed affidavit inside her coat that had suddenly become significantly more urgent. Ethan appeared at her shoulder. "This wasn't an accident," he said. "Low, for her," Lara said. He knows we went somewhere today. He's sending a message. He's trying to scare you off. Clara watched the barn burn. She thought about Thomas, who had been brave enough to ride toward the truth, even knowing it was dangerous. She thought about Samuel Whitaker's face when she'd told him that correcting a mistake was a thing that mattered. She thought about 2 years of surviving, and about the difference between surviving and living, and about the particular stubbornness she had inherited from no one but herself. He made a mistake, she said. Ethan looked at her. Burning that barn is the first thing Garrett Bellamy has done in 2 years that I can prove, she said. Danny saw it. Half the road would have seen it. That fire didn't start itself, and everyone in this county knows it. She turned to look at Ethan fully. He tried to warn me off. Instead, he just handed me a witness and a timeline. She looked back at the flames. Tomorrow morning, she said, we go to Sheriff Brooks. And if Brooks won't act, we ride to the federal marshal's office in Helena. With Samuel's affidavit, she said, and with Danny Crane, and with every piece of evidence my husband died trying to protect. She straightened. Garrett Bellamy has spent 2 years believing I was a woman he could outmaneuver. He was wrong about Thomas. He is more wrong about me. The fire crackled and shifted. A section of the barn roof gave way inward in a slow cascade of sparks. Danny Crane stood beside her and held the horses and didn't say a word, which was exactly right. And somewhere behind them, 3 miles east at the Caldwell place, a lamp still burned in the window, as though the night had left one light on specifically so that Clara Bellamy could find her way back to it. Sheriff Nathaniel Brooks had a particular way of listening to women that Clara had always found infuriating. He listened with his whole face arranged into an expression of careful attention while his eyes did something else, entirely drifted slightly, refocused on a point just past your shoulder. Returned to your face with the manufactured sincerity of a man who had learned that appearing to listen was usually sufficient. Clara had sat across from that face 2 years ago when she'd reported Thomas's death, and she had watched Brooks write down exactly what Garrett Bellamy told him to write down. And she had told herself at the time that it was grief making her suspicious. She was not telling herself that anymore. She walked into Brooks's office at 7 in the morning, before the town was fully awake, with Ethan at her left and Danny Crane at her right, and Samuel Whitaker's signed affidavit folded inside her coat. She had not slept. She had spent the night at the Caldwell place in the spare room. The door between them, the width of a hallway, and the length of 2 people trying to be decent about a situation neither had asked for, and she had lain awake in the dark, listening to the distant sound of her barn cooling into ash, and building the shape of what she intended to say. She had it exactly right by the time the sun came up. Brooks looked up from his desk when they came in. His expression moved through 3 things quickly: surprise, calculation, and the settled professional neutrality he used when he needed time to think. Mrs. Bellamy, he said, I heard about your barn. I was going to ride out this morning. I saved you the trip, Clara said. She sat down without being invited to and placed Samuel's affidavit on his desk. Read that. Brooks looked at the pages. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Clara. Read it, Sheriff, Ethan said. His voice was quiet and entirely without deference. Brooks read it. Clara watched his face the whole time. She was looking for the thing she'd learned to look for in men who were hiding something, the micro-expression that appeared and was suppressed. The slight shift in the muscles around the eyes that happened when a man read something that connected to information he already had. She found it at the 3rd paragraph, the one about the argument on the North property. The one where Garrett said Thomas was going to disappear. Brooks's right eye tightened for 1 second. He knew. He had known something. Maybe not everything, but something. This is a serious document, Brooks said, setting it down. Yes, Clara said, it is. Samuel Whitaker's word against Garrett Bellamy's. A ranch hand who left under unclear circumstances against one of the most established family names in this county. Samuel Whitaker is an eyewitness to a conversation that preceded my husband's death by hours, Clara said. That conversation contained a direct threat. Additionally, she reached into her coat and produced the folded page from Thomas's Bible. My husband's handwriting, land plot numbers, a surveyor's reference code, and the name Harlan Midge, who is a land agent representing mining interests, underlined twice by a man who was dead within the week. Brooks looked at the page. And my barn, Clara said, which burned last night while I was 90 miles away establishing this affidavit, and which at least 4 people on the road saw burning before any natural cause could have started it. Brooks was quiet. Sheriff, Ethan said, we're not here to make your job difficult. We're here because the law in this county failed Clara Bellamy 2 years ago, and we'd like to give it the opportunity to correct that. But if you're not in a position to act on this evidence, we need to know that this morning, because we'll be writing to Helena before noon. The word Helena did something to Brooks's expression that the affidavit alone hadn't done. A federal marshal meant oversight. It meant questions about why a ranch hand's concerns had never been investigated. It meant the kind of scrutiny that reached backward as well as forward. Brooks picked up the affidavit again. He read it a second time, more slowly. I'll need to speak to Whitaker directly, said. Samuel is prepared to make a full statement, Clara said. He's at the Willow Creek rooming house. He came back from Bridger last night. Brooks looked up. He did, Clara said. Because the truth matters more than the deal Garrett Bellamy paid him to maintain. Brooks set the papers down and was quiet for a long moment. Clara could see him calculating not whether to believe her, she thought, but how much this was going to cost him, and in which directions. I'll bring Garrett in for questioning, he said finally. Today, Clara said. Mrs. Bellamy today, Sheriff. Before he has time to move money, destroy documents, or convince Samuel Whitaker that coming back was a mistake. Today. Brooks looked at her with an expression she recognized, the look of a man recalibrating what he was dealing with. Today, he said. Clara stood, picked up Thomas's page but left the affidavit where it was and walked out of the office with Ethan and Danny behind her. On the boardwalk, Danny exhaled like he'd been holding his breath the entire time. You reckon he'll actually do it, the boy said. He'll do something, Ethan said. Whether it's the right something is what we're going to find out. Clara was already thinking ahead. Brooks is going to tell Garrett we came in, she said. Maybe not directly. But Garrett has eyes everywhere in this town and Brooks knows it, and a man who's been managing that relationship for 2 years doesn't break it in a morning. Which means Garrett will move before Brooks reaches him, Ethan said. Which means we need to reach him first. Ethan stopped walking. Clara, not to confront him, she said, I'm not foolish. But Garrett has the original land documents, the ones Thomas found. He's had them for 2 years, either destroyed them or hidden them, because destroying them created its own evidence. If he thinks he's about to be questioned, he'll move them. She turned to face Ethan. I need to get to the land office before he does. That office is technically under his management. That office, Clara said, is on land that belongs to me. The deed gives me unrestricted access to all structures on the Bellamy property. I've just never exercised it, because I didn't know what I was looking for. Ethan studied her face. You've thought this through, he said. I've thought about nothing else since 3 in the morning. He nodded slowly. Danny, he said, without looking away from Clara. Go to the rooming house. Stay with Samuel Whitaker. Don't let him out of your sight, and don't let anyone in who isn't us. Danny straightened like a soldier given an assignment. Yes, sir, he said, and was gone at a run. The land office was a small separate building on the eastern edge of the Bellamy Ranch property, 50 yards from the main house. Thomas had built it in the 4th year of their marriage when the paperwork of running a growing ranch had outgrown the kitchen's table. It smelled like him still cedar and ink and the particular dry warmth of a room that held important things carefully. Clara had not been inside since Thomas died. Garrett had put a new lock on the door 8 months into his management, telling her it was for security purposes. She had her own key, one Thomas had given her when the office was built, kept on the same ring as the house key, which Garrett had apparently not thought to ask her for. She turned the lock and walked in. The room had been reorganized. Thomas's filing system careful, methodical. Every folder labeled in his precise hand had been partially dismantled. New folders, Garrett's less careful scrawl on the tabs. Stacks of correspondence that hadn't been there before. But the original cabinet, the tall oak ones Thomas had commissioned from the furniture maker in Billings, was still against the north wall. Still locked with the original lock, which Garrett apparently didn't have a key for, or hadn't bothered to open. Clara had the key on the same ring. She unlocked it and began going through the drawers. She found it in the bottom drawer, behind a folder of cattle purchase records, from 1882. A plain manila envelope, unsealed, with Thomas's handwriting on the outside. Not his careful office hand, his quick hand, the one he used when he was moving fast. Inside were 7 pages. She spread them on the desk and read them standing up, and what they contained made her sit down. The documents were county records copies, officially stamped, of land surveys of the Bellamy Northern Pasture. The surveys had been commissioned by Harlan Midge's land agency 2 years before Thomas's death. Not one survey, 3 separate surveys, each one progressively more detailed about what was under the northern pasture. Silver deposits, not massive but consistent, the kind of mineral concentration that made a mining operation viable. And attached to the surveys, a draft agreement unsigned, dated 4 months before Thomas died, between the Bellamy Land Trust, represented by Garrett Bellamy, and the Consolidated Mountain Mineral Company out of Denver. Garrett had been negotiating to sell access to the northern pasture mineral rights for 18 months before Thomas discovered it. He had been using Thomas's name on the trust documents without Thomas's knowledge or consent. That was fraud. Federal fraud, given the interstate nature of the mineral company. And when Thomas had found it, Clara pressed her palm flat on the documents to stop her hand from shaking. When Thomas had found it, he had been worth more to Garrett dead than alive. Because a living Thomas would have gone to Brooks, and then to Helena, and Garrett would have faced not just the loss of the deal, but criminal prosecution. But a dead Thomas, survived by a widow that the county had already decided, was too overwhelmed to understand her own business affairs. A dead's left Garrett exactly positioned to complete what he'd started. She was still sitting there when she heard the front door of the land office open. She rose to her feet and turned. Garrett Bellamy stood in the doorway. He was dressed well, as he always was, the careful grooming of a man who understood that appearance was a form of argument. His eyes went from Clara to the open cabinet to the document spread on Thomas's desk, and the calculation in his face moved so fast it was almost impressive. "Clara," he said. His voice was measured. He'd had years of practice at measured. "I heard you'd been to see Brooks this morning." "Word travels fast," Clara said. "In a small town." He stepped inside. "I also heard you've been to Bridger." "Talking to Samuel Whitaker." "You heard quite a lot for a man who claims he's only been managing paperwork." Garrett looked at the documents on the desk. "I can explain those," he said. "I'd love to hear it." He closed the door behind him. The click of the latch was soft, but Clara registered it. She was alone in a room with a man she now believed had arranged her husband's murder, and he had just closed the door. Her pulse spiked once, hard. Then she steadied it, the way Thomas had taught her to steady a spooked horse, not by forcing calm, but by finding it yourself first and letting the animal feel it through the reins. "Those surveys were preliminary," Garrett said. He moved toward the desk with the deliberate ease of a man establishing that he was not concerned, which told her immediately that he was deeply concerned. "I was exploring options on behalf of the family trust." Thomas knew the land wasn't producing. Thomas didn't know anything about it, Clara said. "Because you didn't tell him. Because the trust documents you used have his name on them without his signature. Because it's fraud, Garrett. It was fraud from the first survey you commissioned." Garrett stopped on the other side of the desk. "You don't understand business, Clara." "I understand forgery," she said. "I understand that you put Thomas's name on an agreement he never saw. I understand that when he found out, you threatened him on the northern pasture with a man named Reddick standing beside you. And I understand that my husband rode out the next morning and never came home." She held his gaze. "So don't tell me what I don't understand." Something shifted in Garrett's face. The controlled surface cracked slightly. and what she saw underneath wasn't guilt. It was fury, cold, cornered, dangerous. "Samuel Whitaker is a drifter and a coward," he said. "His word means nothing. His signed affidavit means something," Clara said. "And these documents mean something. And the 3 surveyors who produced them still have their own copies on file with the county, which you apparently forgot when you were busy burning my barn last night." Garrett went very still. "I don't know what happened to your barn." "Cal Reddick does," Clara said. The name hit him like a physical thing. She watched it land. "You know that name," she said. "And when the federal marshal hears it, he'll know it too, because Reddick left Texas ahead of a warrant, and a man with an outstanding warrant is in no position to protect the person who hired him." Garrett leaned forward on the desk. "Clara," his voice had dropped, all the social grace stripped out of it. "You are a woman alone on a piece of land that is worth considerably more than you know. You have no family, no resources beyond what I could remove in a week. And you are about to make a very serious mistake." Clara looked at him across her husband's desk, in her husband's office, on her husband's land. "No," she said, "you made the serious mistake 2 years ago on the North property. And everyone you've made since has been trying to cover that one." She picked up the manila envelope and the documents inside it. "Get off my property, Garrett, and don't come back." Garrett straightened. His face had gone to something she'd never seen on it before, something stripped of the performance, something that was the actual face underneath. "You'll regret this," he said. "Maybe," Clara said. "But not as much as you will." He left. She waited until she heard his horse move away from the building at a controlled pace, not a run, because running would have admitted something, and then she let out one long, slow breath. Her hands were shaking badly now. She pressed them flat on the desk and breathed until they stopped. Then she folded the documents back into the envelope and walked out of the land office into the morning. Ethan was waiting outside 10 feet from the door. He'd positioned himself where he could see both the entrance and the road close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd the situation. He took one look at her face. "How long had he been in there?" he said. "Long enough," Clara said. "Ethan, he knows we have Reddick's name. He's going to run, or he's going to do something worse, before Brooks reaches him." "I know," Ethan said. "He was already moving. I went for Brooks while you were inside." "He's on his way." But he stopped. "What?" "Brooks didn't send for Garrett before he came here," Ethan said. "Someone else did. There was a boy leaving Brooks's office when I got there, not Danny. A boy I didn't recognize, and Brooks looked like a man who'd just sent a message he wasn't sure about." Clara closed her eyes briefly. "He warned him," she said. "I think so. Then Garrett already knew when he came in here." She processed that. "He came to get the documents before he ran. He thought I didn't know what I was looking at." "Do you think he'll run?" Clara thought about the man she'd just faced across the desk. The fury underneath the control, the cornered quality of it. "No," she said slowly, "he's not going to run. Running admits guilt and loses everything. He's going to fight. He's going to try to reframe everything before the federal marshal gets here. Say the documents were authorized. Say Samuel is a disgruntled employee. Say I'm a hysterical widow who doesn't understand what she found." She looked at Ethan. "He's going to be very convincing," she said. "He's been very convincing for 2 years. What do we do?" Clara thought. "The mining company," she said. "The Consolidated Mountain Mineral Company out of Denver. They have their own copies of these surveys. They have the draft agreement with Thomas's name on it. They are not going to want to be connected to a murder investigation. They'll cooperate with a federal marshal to protect their own interests." "That's leverage in the other direction," Ethan said. "That's how we prove the fraud independent of anything Samuel says or I say," Clara said. "We don't need Garrett to confess. We need the paper trail to speak for itself." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Then you've changed." Clara looked at him. "Since I've known you," he said. "You walked into this situation still carrying 2 years of doubt about yourself. About your own judgment. About whether you had the right to be angry." He paused. "You're not carrying that anymore." Clara considered this. "Thomas used to say that grief and fury can't live in the same room," she said. "I think what he meant was that one has to move before the other can. She looked down at the envelope in her hands. I've been grieving, now I'm furious, and furious is considerably more useful. They went back to Brooks's office to find that Brooks had indeed sent a deputy to locate Garrett, and that the deputy had returned with the information that Garrett Bellamy's horse was gone from the stable. His personal effects from the hotel reduced by 1 saddlebag, and Garrett himself was not findable in Willow Creek. Brooks sat behind his desk, looking like a man who had stepped into something he couldn't step back out of. He's not running far, Ethan said before Clara could speak. He doesn't have the documents. He doesn't have Reddick, who's probably 2 counties away by now. And he can't complete the land deal without establishing legal ownership, which requires courts, which requires showing up. He'll be back, Clara said, or he'll send someone. Either way, the time to move is now. She put the manila envelope on Brooks's desk. That is the original evidence my husband found, she said. With those documents and Samuel Whitaker's affidavit, you have enough to contact the federal marshal in Helena. Not to request assistance, to report a murder and a fraud conspiracy that crossed state lines. She leaned forward. And Sheriff, I want to be plain with you about something. Brooks looked at her. I don't know exactly what you knew 2 years ago, she said. I don't know if you made a mistake or made a choice. But I know that what you do today is going to matter considerably more than what you did then. You have a chance to be the sheriff this county deserves. I'd like you to take it. The room was very quiet. Brooks looked at the envelope on his desk for a long moment. Then he reached for it. I'll telegraph Helena today, he said. Thank you, Clara said. She stood. One more thing. What? Danny Crane, she said. The boy who pulled my horses out of the burning barn last night. I want his name on the official record. What he did took real courage. This county should know about it. Brooks blinked, apparently not having expected that particular request. Oh yes, he said. I'll note it. Clara left with Ethan, and on the boardwalk she stood for a moment in the thin autumn sunlight, feeling the weight of what she was carrying and what she'd set in motion, and she thought about Thomas. She thought about how he would have handled this morning, methodically, honestly, without theatrics. She thought about how he'd always believed that the truth had a kind of structural integrity that lies lacked, that given enough time and enough people willing to speak it, the truth held up and the lies didn't. He'd been right. He'd just died before the truth had time to work. What happens now? Ethan said beside her. Now we wait for Helena, Clara said. And we make sure Samuel stays safe, and we make sure every person in this county who has a piece of this story is ready to tell it when the time comes. She started walking, and we rebuild the barn, she added. Ethan fell into step beside her. I have timber, he said. I know, she said. They walked through Willow Creek in the late morning, with the sky wide open overhead and the entire town, Clara knew, watching from windows and doorways, constructing their various versions of what was happening. She could feel the weight of their looking, the whispered recalculations, the widow who was supposed to be finished, walking through town with her head up and a federal case folded inside her coat. She thought about Margaret Hollis and her careful sympathy. She thought about Brooks and his listening face that wasn't listening. She thought about Garrett, somewhere on the road between here and whatever he believed was safety. And then she stopped thinking about all of them, because a woman named Elizabeth Crane, Danny's mother, a solid, weathered ranching woman who'd never been particularly warm to Clara, was standing on the steps of the dry goods store. And as Clara approached, she stepped down and said, without preamble, I heard what Danny did last night. Yes, Clara said. He could have been hurt. He could have, Clara agreed. He wasn't. Elizabeth Crane looked at her for a moment with the frank evaluating look of a frontier woman who didn't waste expressions. He said, you called him the bravest boy in the territory. I meant it. A pause. If you need help rebuilding that barn, Elizabeth Crane said, Tom and I can spare 2 days next week. Clara looked at her. She had not expected that. She had been so braced for the town to remain in its carefully managed distance that the simple directness of the offer caught her completely unprepared. I'd be grateful, she said. Elizabeth Crane nodded once, went back up her steps, and that was that. But it was not just that, because Joseph Crane emerged from the mercantile, and the man from the feed store, and Reverend Hollis himself without his wife, which Clara noted, and each of them, in the plain-spoken way of frontier people who communicated more efficiently than they were usually given credit for, found a version of the same thing to say. They'd heard about the barn. They'd heard about Samuel. They didn't know all the details and weren't asking for them. But something had shifted in the morning air of Willow Creek, Montana territory, and these people, who had been writing Clara Bellamy's story for her, had picked up the page and discovered it wasn't what they'd been told. Ethan stood a step back and let it happen, which was exactly right. And Clara stood in the middle of the town, she was finished, and received each plain offer the way Thomas had taught her to receive things given with genuine intent directly, without self-diminishment, without excessive gratitude. Because excessive gratitude implied you hadn't expected to be treated like a person, and Clara Bellamy had decided. Somewhere between the burning barn and the land office and the look on Garrett Bellamy's face when she said Cal Reddick's name, that she was done implying that. She had always been a person. She had always been enough. The only thing that had changed was that she had stopped waiting for the world to agree. She was walking back toward her property, Ethan beside her, when Danny Crane came running down the road from the rooming house, with the expression that Clara had come to recognize as his particular brand of urgent news delivery. He skidded to a stop in front of them, breathing hard. "Mr. Whitaker," he said. Clara went still. "What about him?" "He's gone," Danny said. "I went to check on him like Mr. Caldwell said, and the woman at the desk said a man came to see him. About an hour ago, big man. Didn't give a name." Clara and Ethan looked at each other. "Did Samuel leave with him?" Ethan asked. "No, sir," Danny said. "Samuel left alone." The boy hesitated. She said he looked like he'd been told something that scared him very bad. The morning that had been for a brief window, moving toward resolution, shifted on its axis. Clara turned and started walking fast toward the rooming house, Ethan matching her stride. "Reddick," she said. "Or someone working for Garrett," Ethan said. "Telling Samuel his deal is back on the table, or his safety is compromised." "One or the other. Samuel signed those papers," Clara said. "He chose to come back. He's a frightened man who made one brave decision," Ethan said, not unkindly. "Frightened men can unmake brave decisions, when the fear gets loud enough." Clara knew he was right. She also knew that if Samuel disappeared again, they lost their eyewitness. The documents were strong, but a living man who'd witnessed a direct threat was the difference between a case a federal marshal would prosecute aggressively and one he'd approach carefully. She needed Samuel Whitaker. More than that, Samuel Whitaker needed someone to believe that the choice he'd made was worth the fear it cost him. She knew something about that. The woman at the rooming house desk told them Samuel had left on foot, heading south toward the edge of town. 10 minutes ahead of them. Clara went through the building and out the back, without stopping to ask further questions. She found him at the edge of the south pasture road, standing beside his horse, not mounted yet. Just standing, the way a man stands when he's made a decision and is steeling himself to follow through on it and hasn't quite gotten there yet. "Samuel," she called. He turned. His face confirmed everything Danny had described. Clara walked up to him and stopped. "Who came to the rooming house?" she said. Samuel's jaw worked. "A man I didn't know said he was a friend of Mr. Garrett's. Said that the affidavit wasn't legal because I signed it under duress. Said if I retracted it by end of day, Garrett would see to it I was compensated, and the whole matter would go away quietly." He looked at her. "Said if I didn't retract it, there were people who knew where my sister lived in Kansas City." The cold that moved through Clara was not fear. It had moved past fear and arrived somewhere harder. "Samuel," she said, "look at me." He did. "That man threatened your sister because you are the most dangerous witness in this case," she said. "He threatened her because Garrett is scared. And Garrett is scared because we have the documents in your affidavit and a federal case that is already moving toward Helena." She paused. "A man threatens your family when he has run out of legitimate options. That's not strength. That's a cornered animal." Samuel said nothing. Your sister is in Kansas City, Ethan said from behind Clara. Kansas City is outside Garrett Bellamy's reach. He is a county land fraudster with a murder charge building against him. He does not have long-range power. He has local power, and we are in the process of removing it. Samuel looked between them. I'm afraid, he said. Simply, without apology. I know, Clara said. I've been afraid since the morning I picked up that saddle and knew something was wrong with it and told myself it wasn't. She held his gaze. Being afraid doesn't mean the choice was wrong. It means it was hard. There's a difference. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. The south pasture road stretched away toward the edge of Willow Creek, and beyond it the land opened up into the wide Montana plain, and it would have been very easy. Clara understood this completely, to just ride south and keep riding. Samuel Whitaker mounted his horse. Clara's stomach dropped. Then he turned the horse around, facing north, back toward town. The federal marshal, he said. When he comes, I'll be here. Clara, she said. Don't thank me, Samuel said. Just make sure it counts. It will, she said. I promise you it will. They rode back toward town together, all three of them, and the sky above the Montana Territory was wide and cold and entirely indifferent to the human drama moving beneath it. The way skies in that part of the world tended to be massive and impersonal and beautiful. But the ground beneath Clara Bellamy's feet was hers. Every inch of it. And the woman who had spent 2 years being told she was finished had spent this morning proving, one conversation at a time, one truth at a time, one person at a time, that she had not yet begun. The federal marshal arrived on a Thursday. His name was Arthur Dean, a lean, gray-templed man of 50 or so, who had the particular economy of movement that came from spending 30 years in the kind of work where unnecessary motion got people killed. He rode into Willow Creek without announcement, tied his horse at the post outside Brooks's office, and spent 4 hours inside with the door closed before anyone in town knew exactly what was happening. Clara knew because Danny Crane was positioned at the corner of the feed store with the specific mission of watching that door and running the moment it opened. He ran at 2:30 in the afternoon. He's coming out, Danny said, slightly breathless. And he's got Brooks with him. And Brooks looks like a man who swallowed something that didn't agree with him. Clara set down her sewing and stood up from the kitchen table. Go back, she said. Tell me where they go. Danny was already gone. She'd spent the 3 days since their last meeting with Samuel preparing, with the focused calm of a woman who had identified the one thing she could control in a situation that had many moving parts and had decided to control it completely. The documents were organized. 3 copies of Samuel's affidavit were distributed, one with Clara, one with Ethan, one sent by post to a lawyer in Helena, whose name Ethan had supplied from his Texas connections. Thomas's Bible page was preserved between 2 pieces of cardboard. She had written out a clear, chronological account of everything from the saddle, to Bridger, to the land office, to the barn fire, to the threat against Samuel's sister in Thomas's precise style. Because his precision had always been better than her own, and she owed him at least the tribute of trying. She had also done something she hadn't anticipated doing. She had written a letter to Harlan Midge, not threatening, not angry, simply factual. She informed him that she was in possession of the draft mineral rights agreement bearing her husband's forged signature, that a federal investigation was underway, and that his cooperation with the marshal's office would be noted favorably versus his non-cooperation, which would be noted differently. She had Ethan read it before she sent it. That's going to work, Ethan had said after reading it. I know, Clara had said. Men like Midge don't have loyalty. They have interests. And his interest right now is to be the one who cooperated. The letter had gone out 2 days ago. She expected a response within the week. She was standing at her front fence, the fence where everything had started when Danny came back. Marshal Dean wants to see you, the boy said, at Brooks's office. Now, Clara took off her work gloves and laid them on the fence post. How did he say it? She said. Dean. What exactly were his words? Danny thought carefully, because he'd learned that Clara valued precision. He said, Tell Mrs. Bellamy I'd be grateful for her time this afternoon, at her convenience. And then Brooks said something under his breath, and Marshal Dean looked at him, and Brooks stopped talking. Clara almost smiled. "All right," she said, "let's go." Arthur Dean stood when she entered the office, which told her immediately what kind of man he was. Not the performative gallantry of men trying to impress, but the automatic respect of someone who'd been raised to stand for people deserving of it and had never stopped. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, "thank you for coming. Please sit." She sat. Brooks was in the corner of the room with the expression of a man who had been comprehensively repositioned in the hierarchy and was still adjusting. "I've reviewed the affidavit and the documents you provided," Dean said. He had a direct, unhurried manner of speaking that Clara found immediately trustworthy. "I've also spoken at length with Samuel Whitaker, who I found to be a credible witness despite his delay in coming forward. People make frightened choices. What matters is that he chose to correct it." He paused. "I've sent telegrams to Denver regarding the Consolidated Mountain Mineral Company and to the Texas Warrant Office regarding a man named Calvin Reddick. And I've been in communication with the Territorial Court in Helena." Clara kept her breathing steady. "I want to be honest with you about where we are," Dean continued. "The fraud case is solid. The forged signatures, the unauthorized use of the trust, the draft agreement that's federal territory, clear and provable. What's harder is the charge of murder." "Samuel heard the threat," Clara said. "He heard a threat. A lawyer, the right kind of lawyer, the expensive kind which Garrett Bellamy can afford, will argue that a threat made in a heated argument about business is not evidence of premeditated murder." He held up a hand before she could speak. "However, Calvin Reddick is a different matter." Clara waited. "Reddick was apprehended 2 days ago in Cheyenne," Dean said. "He'd been picked up on the outstanding Texas warrant. When my colleague informed him that a murder investigation was opening in Montana territory and offered him the distinction between being a witness and being a defendant, Mr. Reddick made some decisions about his priorities." The room was very still. "He talked," Dean confirmed, "at considerable length. He has given a full account of his engagement by Garrett Bellamy, the nature of his instructions, and the events of the morning of August 14, 1884, on the northern property of the Bellamy Ranch." Clara pressed her hands flat on her knees. "August 14, 1884. The day Thomas hadn't come home for supper. He confirmed it was not an accident," she said. It was not a question. She needed to hear it said plainly. "He confirmed it was not an accident," Dean said. With full weight, no softening. Clara sat with that for a moment. 2 years of grief that had been built on a lie, now given its true shape. There was a particular quality of pain in having the worst thing you suspected confirmed, not the surprise of new information, but the terrible settling of something that had been waiting. She breathed through it. "What happens next?" she said. "I'll be issuing a warrant for Garrett Bellamy's arrest," Dean said. "He was located yesterday afternoon in Bozeman, attempting to negotiate an early settlement on some property investments. He doesn't yet know about Reddick." He paused. "He'll be brought back to Willow Creek and held for territorial court. The proceedings will take time, months, most likely. I want you to be prepared for that. I've been prepared for difficulty for 2 years, Marshal," Clara said. "A few more months won't break me." Dean looked at her with the frank appraisal of a man who judged people by what they did with trouble. "No," he said, "I don't imagine it will." He stood. She stood. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, extending his hand. "Your husband kept careful records, and you kept your courage. Between the two of you, you built a case that most trained investigators would have been hard-pressed to construct." He shook her hand once firmly. "Thomas Bellamy would be proud of you." Clara held the handshake 1 beat longer than was strictly necessary. "He would have done the same for me," she said. "That's who he was." She walked out of Brooks's office into the afternoon and stood on the boardwalk and breathed. Garrett Bellamy was going to be arrested. The truth about Thomas was going to be a matter of official record. She had done it. She and Samuel and Ethan and a 14-year-old boy, with more courage than most grown men in the county, had done it. She waited to feel triumphant. Instead, she felt something quieter and more complicated, a grief for Thomas that was different now than it had been this morning. Cleaner somehow, like a wound finally properly dressed after 2 years of makeshift binding. She was still standing there when Ethan found her. He came around the corner of the building and took one look at her face and knew, with the particular perceptiveness he'd demonstrated consistently for the past weeks, exactly what had happened and exactly what she needed, which was not to be asked about it immediately. He stood beside her. They were quiet for a long moment. "Reddick talked," she said finally. "I know. Danny heard it from the deputy." He paused. "Are you all right?" "I don't know what I am," she said honestly. "I know what I've done. I know what's going to happen next." "I'm not sure those things and all right are in the same room yet." "They don't have to be," Ethan said. She turned to look at him. Standing there in the afternoon light, this man she had known for 6 weeks and would have said, on the morning they met, was the last kind of person she needed anywhere near her life. She looked at him and understood something she'd been not looking at for most of those 6 weeks. She cared about him, not the careful, guarded acknowledgement of a useful neighbor. Not the gratitude of a woman who'd been helped, something warmer and more frightening than either of those things. And because she had spent 2 years learning the cost of not saying things that mattered, she nearly said it. Nearly. Instead, she said thank you. He looked at her for a moment. "Don't thank me," he said. "You found the saddle. You found Thomas's papers. You went to Bridger. You walked into a room alone with a man who had every reason to hurt you." He shook his head slightly. "I stood nearby. There's a difference. You stood beside me," she said. "There's also a difference." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I should let you get home. You'll want some time before." "Ethan," he stopped. "Have supper with me tonight," she said. "At my house, not to discuss the case, not to plan anything." She held his gaze. "Just supper." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she'd finally learned to name. "I'll be there at 6, he said. He tipped his hat and walked away. Clara went home and made a proper supper for the first time in 2 years, not the functional cooking she'd been doing for survival, but real cooking, the kind Thomas had always said was evidence of civilization. The kind where you made more than was strictly necessary, and the kitchen smelled like something worth coming home to. She was still cooking when she heard the horse on the road. 2 horses, then voices, male voices, moving fast. Clara dried her hands and stepped outside. 3 horses had stopped on the road before her property. 2 men she didn't recognize, large, road dusty, the look of men who rode for wages, and between them, bound at the wrists, was Garrett Bellamy. Marshal Dean was not with them. These were not federal men. Clara's stomach tightened. One of the men she didn't know tipped his hat in a mockery of courtesy. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, "we're returning your brother-in-law to the county. Marshal Dean asked us to write him up from Bozeman." Garrett looked at her. His hands were bound, but his face was not the face of a man who'd been broken. "It was the face of a man running calculations, Clara," he said. His voice was even, almost warm. "I'd like to speak with you." "You can speak to Marshal Dean," Clara said. "Marshal Dean is a fair man," Garrett said. "But he's working from incomplete information. I think you deserve to hear the complete story before this goes to court." "I have the complete story," Clara said. "Reddick gave it." Something shifted in Garrett's face fast, controlled but real. "Reddick is a hired man who will say whatever he's paid to say," Garrett said. "You know that. You're an intelligent woman, Clara. You always have been." He leaned forward slightly, which given the wrist binding was an awkward gesture and probably intended to be a human one. "Thomas found those documents. I know that, and I know how it looked. But Thomas misunderstood what I was doing. I was trying to protect the ranch. The mineral rights deal would have brought in enough income to secure the Bellamy land for the next 50 years. I was going to tell Thomas. I was going to explain. And then the accident happened, and everything became." "Stop," Clara said. "The accident," she said. "You're still calling it an accident." "It was. Reddick said otherwise," Clara said. "Under oath, to a federal marshal, and you can call him whatever you like, a hired man, a liar. A man who says what he's paid to say, but you hired him, Garrett. He was your man to hire, and the things he says you told him to do were the things he did. She held his gaze without flinching. Thomas is in the ground. My barn is ash. Samuel Whitaker spent 2 years afraid to tell the truth because you threatened him. And you are standing at my fence, calling it an accident. Garrett looked at her. I want to speak to my lawyer, he said. To the men holding him. You'll get that opportunity, the taller man said. In Willow Creek, they rode on. Clara stood at the fence until they were gone. Then she went back inside and finished cooking supper, because the supper was real and the cooking was real, and she was not going to let Garrett Bellamy take that from her the way he'd taken so many other things. Ethan arrived at 6 exactly. He came through the front gate and stopped when he saw her face. I heard they rode Garrett through town, he said. He stopped to talk, Clara said. Ethan waited. He's still calling it an accident, she said. Something moved through Ethan's expression. He'll call it that until the jury tells him different, he said. And then he'll call it a misunderstanding. I know, Clara said. I know what kind of man he is. She stepped back from the doorway. Come in. Supper's ready. They ate at the kitchen table where Thomas used to eat, and Clara had a strange layered feeling of past and present existing simultaneously in the same room, Thomas's absence with its familiar texture. And this new presence which was nothing like Thomas and not trying to be, and was its own thing entirely. They talked about the bay mare, who had come fully sound on her right foreleg. They talked about Ethan's plans for the south pasture drainage. They talked about Danny Crane, who had apparently informed his mother that he intended to become a federal marshal when he grew up, which Elizabeth Crane had received with the complicated pride of a woman who'd raised exactly the child she'd tried to raise and wasn't entirely sure how she felt about it. At one point, Clara laughed at something Ethan said, a real laugh, the unguarded kind, and heard herself laughing and didn't press her hand to her mouth. After supper, she washed the dishes and Ethan dried them, standing beside her at the basin, and it was ordinary and specific, and nothing about it was performing itself for an audience, and Clara thought that this quiet, practical, side-by-side ordinariness was the thing she had missed most. Not the dramatic architecture of love, the everyday texture of it. Ethan, she said. Yes, what are you going to do after this is settled? She kept her eyes on the dish she was washing. After the trial. After everything goes back to whatever normal looks like. He was quiet for a moment. I was thinking about that, he said. I've been thinking about it for about 3 weeks. And I'd like to stay, he said, in Willow Creek. On the Harmon place, a pause, if there's reason to. Clara handed him the dish. I think there might be reason to, she said. He dried the dish and set it on the shelf. And when he turned back, she was already looking at him, because she was done looking away from things that mattered. I am still figuring out what I am without grief running the whole operation, she said. I want you to know that. I'm not back to myself yet. Or maybe I'm more myself than I've been, I can't tell. But I'm not finished becoming whatever I'm becoming. I know that, Ethan said. And I'm not going to be a woman who needs managing, she said. Or protecting, or deciding things for. I know that too, he said, with the slight quality of a man who finds the suggestion almost comically unnecessary. Clara, I have never in 6 weeks wanted to manage or protect or decide for you. I have wanted to stand next to you while you did things. That is a significantly different project. Clara looked at him. You're a strange man, Ethan Caldwell, she said. So I've been told, he said. She almost said the rest of it then, the actual thing, the one she'd been not saying for weeks. But something stopped her. Not fear, exactly. More the particular instinct of a woman who'd spent 2 years learning the weight of words and had developed respect for the right timing. Good night, she said instead. Good night, he said. He got his hat and walked to the door, and she watched him go with the feeling of someone standing at the edge of a very large thing, not yet ready to step in, but entirely certain that she would. He stopped at the door. Yes, for what it's worth, he said, not turning around quite yet. I didn't stand beside you because I thought you needed someone to. He turned then. I stood beside you because I wanted to be there, he said. There's a difference. He left. Clara stood in her kitchen in the house Thomas had built, holding a dish towel, smiling in a way that had nothing to do with being appropriate about it. The weeks that followed were hard in the specific way that justice is hard, slow, procedural, punctuated by sudden lurches forward. The territorial court proceedings in Helena were set for early winter. Dean was thorough and prepared, and Reddick's testimony under oath was consistent with everything he'd told the marshal initially. Harlan Midge, exactly as Clara had predicted, cooperated fully. His letter arrived 11 days after hers, 4 pages of detailed cooperation, including the dates of every meeting he'd had with Garrett, the specific representations Garrett had made about Thomas's involvement in the agreement, and copies of his own records of the draft contract. It was, Clara thought, reading it, the letter of a man writing as fast as his pen could move to get on the right side of something. She forwarded it directly to Dean. "You were right about Midge," Ethan said when she told him. "Self-interest is the most reliable force in business," Clara said. "Thomas taught me that. He said the men who claim they're only in it for principle are the ones you watch most carefully." The barn rebuilding happened the second week of October. Elizabeth and Tom Crane came as promised and brought their 2 eldest sons. 3 other ranching families showed up without being asked, partly because Elizabeth had mentioned it, partly because frontier communities were, underneath all the judgment and the whispers, fundamentally practical about labor. And a woman rebuilding what arson had destroyed was a situation that called for hands. Ethan was there from dawn. He worked alongside Tom Crane and the other men without positioning himself as the man in charge of it, which Clara noticed and was grateful for. Because it was her barn on her land, and she was directing the reconstruction, and he understood that entirely. By the end of the second day, the frame was up. Clara stood and looked at it in the fading afternoon, and she thought about Thomas, who had built the original with his own hands the second year of their marriage. She thought about how he would have stood exactly where she was standing, hands on his hips, and said something practical and pleased. "Good bones," Ethan said beside her. "Yes," she said. "It'll hold." She didn't mean only the barn. The court date in Helena was set for the 15th of November. On the 12th, 3 days before, something happened that no one had anticipated. Brooks came to Clara's door at 8 in the morning. Not with his professional face on, with the face of a man who'd spent several weeks making a private accounting of something, and had arrived at a number he wasn't proud of. "Mrs. Bay, come in." She stepped back. He sat at her kitchen table, the same table where 2 years ago he'd taken her statement about Thomas's accident in that listening but not listening way, and he put his hat on his knee and looked at it. "I owe you an honest conversation," he said. Clara sat across from him. "When Thomas died," Brooks said, "Garrett came to me the same evening, before the body had been brought down from the north property. He told me what happened, the accident, the horse, all of it. He had the details very clear, very organized." He paused. "I thought at the time that it was because he'd been there, that he'd found Thomas, and that's why the details were so complete." "He was there," Clara said. "He was there before Thomas was." "I know that now." Brooks looked up. "I think I half knew it then. And I told myself it was grief making me suspicious. That Garrett was a Bellamy, and there was no reason I told myself things I should not have told myself." Clara was quiet. "I'm not asking you to forgive my negligence," Brooks said. "I'm telling you, because you deserve to know that it wasn't. I didn't take money from him. I wasn't in his arrangement. I was just stopped." "You were just a man who found it easier to believe the comfortable story," Clara said. "Yes," he said, "I was. Sheriff," Clara said. "What you do from today forward matters more than what you did or didn't do 2 years ago. You've cooperated with Marshal Dean. You've provided your records. You came here this morning and told me the truth when you didn't have to." She paused. "That's not nothing." Brooks looked at her. "You are a more generous woman than I have any right to expect," he said. "I'm a practical one," Clara said. "This county needs a sheriff after this is done. If you're a man who can learn from a serious mistake and do his job with more courage going forward, that's worth more to me than your guilt." Brooks stood. He put his hat on. He was at the door when he turned back. Thomas used to say you were the clearest thinking person he knew, he said. I understand that better now than I did. After he left, Clara sat at the kitchen table alone for a while. Then she got up and went to the desk and wrote a letter to Samuel Whitaker. She thanked him, specifically and at length, for coming back. For staying. For choosing the truth twice, once in Bridger when he wrote to her, and once in Willow Creek when it was hardest. She told him that when the trial was over and the land was fully hers, she intended to offer him his foreman back if he wanted it. That the Bellamy Ranch was going to need good people, and that a man who'd made a mistake and corrected it at personal cost was exactly the kind of person she wanted on her land. She sealed it and addressed it to the rooming house. Then she sat back and looked at the kitchen of the house Thomas had built and thought about what it meant to rebuild something. Not restore, not return to what it was. Rebuild, which meant keeping the good bones and building something new from them, something that belonged to now rather than to what was lost. She was thinking about that when she heard hooves on the road and looked out the window and saw Ethan riding past, not stopping, just riding by in the direction of his own place, not looking toward her window. But as he passed the fence post where they'd first spoken, he reached out and touched it once, lightly, with 2 fingers. Just that. Clara pressed her hand flat against the window glass for a moment. Then she smiled and turned back to the room and began making plans. The trial lasted 11 days. Clara sat in the territorial courtroom in Helena for every one of them. She had been offered the option of submitting her testimony by written deposition. Marshal Dean had suggested it, gently. In the way of a man who understood that 11 days in a courtroom, watching the machinery of justice process your husband's murder, was not a small thing to ask of anyone. Clara had thanked him and declined. She was not going to be a woman who sent words to stand in for her when the moment required her actual presence. She sat in the 3rd row, behind the prosecutor's table, every morning when the court opened and every afternoon until it closed. She wore the same dark blue dress 4 days running because it was the most composed thing she owned, and composure was what she had decided to bring into that room. Ethan sat beside her each day without being asked, which she had not expected, and which she did not remark on, because some things were better received in silence than in acknowledgement. Samuel Whitaker testified on the 3rd day. He walked to the stand with the careful deliberateness of a man carrying something fragile that he was determined not to drop, and he told the story exactly as he'd told it in his small front room in Bridger the North property. The argument. Garrett's threat, the horse tied at the boundary marker. Reddick standing large and quiet at Garrett's shoulder. He told it without embellishment and without evasion. And when Garrett's lawyer, an expensive Helena man named, who had the aggressive precision of a terrier, spent 40 minutes trying to dismantle his credibility, Samuel answered every question in the same steady voice. Clara watched the jury watch Samuel. She had learned, in 11 days, to read the jury the way she read horses through small signals. The set of the shoulders, the direction of the eyes, the quality of their stillness or their restlessness. By the 3rd day, she believed she understood 7 of the 12. By the 6th day, after Reddick's testimony, she believed she understood 10. Calvin Reddick was not a sympathetic witness. He was a large, flat-eyed man who answered questions with the minimum number of words, and he had, after all, stood on a northern Montana pasture and been part of the events that led to Thomas Bellamy's death. Clara did not feel warmth toward him, but she felt a cold, clear gratitude for his self-interest, because every word he said under oath was a word the jury heard, and the jury heard enough. On the 9th day, Fowler made a move that Clara had been waiting for. He requested that Thomas's land documents be excluded from evidence on the grounds that Clara had removed them from what he characterized as jointly managed property, implying she had no right to access them without Garrett's presence. Clara sat very still when she heard this. Ethan's hand found her wrist under the table, not gripping, just present, the way you steady something without constraining it. The judge, a methodical man named Aldrich, who had the patience of someone who'd heard every argument twice, already looked at Fowler over his reading glasses. The deed of the Bellamy property, he said, is in Mrs. Bellamy's name, inherited from her deceased husband. The structure from which the documents were retrieved sits on that property. Counsel will clarify what joint management arrangement supersedes a legal deed. Fowler began to explain. Aldrich listened for approximately 45 seconds. Motion denied, he said, and moved on. Clara breathed. Ethan's hand withdrew, which was exactly right. On the 10th day, Harlan Midge testified by written deposition. He had agreed to cooperate but declined to appear in person, which Dean had accepted as the pragmatic compromise of a man whose cooperation was worth more than his presence. The deposition was read into the record by the court clerk in a flat, documentary voice that somehow made the detailed account of Garrett's fraudulent negotiations even more damning, the flat recitation of facts, stripping away any possibility of misinterpretation. When the clerk finished reading, the courtroom was very quiet. Clara looked at Garrett. He was sitting at the defense table with the controlled composure he'd maintained throughout the trial, upright, attentive, the image of a man wrongly accused. But she had been watching his face for 10 days, and she could see, beneath the performance, the thing that had been there in the land office when she'd said Cal Reddick's name. The cornered quality, the fury of a man who'd arranged everything carefully and had the arrangements come apart anyway. On the 11th day, the jury deliberated for 4 hours. Clara and Ethan waited in the corridor outside the courtroom. She was not able to sit. She walked a short circuit between the courtroom door and the window at the end of the corridor, while Ethan leaned against the wall and tracked her without comment. Samuel sat on a bench with his hat in his hands. Danny Crane, who had traveled to Helena with his father's blessing and Clara's private relief, sat beside Samuel and kept up a careful, quiet commentary that seemed to be helping Samuel more than silence would have. After the 4th hour, the door opened. The jury filed back in. Clara sat in the 3rd row and folded her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead. The foreman stood. He read the verdict on the charge of fraud in a voice that carried clearly to the back of the room. Guilty. He read the verdict on the charge of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty. He read the verdict on the charge of murder in the 1st degree. Guilty. The courtroom absorbed this in the particular way that large rooms absorb decisive moments, a collective held breath, then the release of it, then the individual responses fragmenting away from the collective, like water finding separate paths. Clara did not cry. She had thought she might and had prepared herself for it. But what she felt in the moment of hearing those 3 verdicts was something that had no simple name: grief and relief and the cold finality of truth being officially recognized, and something she could only describe as Thomas somewhere finally resting. She sat with it. Ethan said nothing. He simply sat beside her in the emptying courtroom while the official machinery moved around them, Garrett being taken, Fowler talking rapidly to someone, the judge making notes, the jury dispersing, and he let her have the moment in its full complexity without rushing her toward any particular feeling about it. "Thank you," she said finally. "For what specifically?" he said. "For not telling me how I'm supposed to feel right now," she said. "I wouldn't know how you're supposed to feel," he said. "I only know how you feel, and that's yours." She looked at him. "Ethan Caldwell," she said, "you are going to make this very difficult." "What very difficult?" "Keeping a reasonable distance," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Clara," he said, "I've been at a reasonable distance for 4 months. I am genuinely tired of it." She almost laughed. Instead, she stood, straightened her blue dress, and walked out of the courtroom into the Helena afternoon, where Samuel Whitaker was standing on the steps with his face turned up to the sky with specific expression of a man who has put something down after carrying it for a very long time. "Samuel," she said. He looked at her. "Come back to the ranch," she said. "For real this time. Same terms Thomas gave you, adjusted for 2 years." Samuel blinked. "You offered that before," he said. "In the letter. I thought maybe you'd reconsider after the trial." "I don't reconsider things I've thought through," Clara said. "The offer stands." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "I'll come back," he said, "on one condition." "What condition?" "That you let me rebuild the tack room in the new barn," he said. "The way Mr. Thomas had it. I remember where everything went." Clara felt something move in her chest. "Deal," she said. They shook hands on the steps of the territorial courthouse in Helena, Montana, in November of 1886. And Danny Crane watched this with the bright-eyed attention of someone filing it carefully in the part of his memory reserved for things worth keeping. The ride home took 2 days. On the first evening, they made camp along the road, Clara and Ethan and Samuel and Danny, and ate the food Elizabeth Crane had packed for her son with the thoroughness of a woman who did not trust strange towns to feed people adequately. The fire was good, and the food was better, and the conversation moved in the natural way of people who had been through something significant together, and were now in the particular aftermath where everything feels slightly unreal and slightly more real than usual simultaneously. Danny fell asleep against his saddle within an hour. Samuel excused himself not long after. Clara and Ethan sat beside the fire in the quiet. "What happens to the northern pasture?" Ethan asked. "It goes back to cattle," Clara said. "I'm not selling the mineral rights." "Not to Midge's company or anyone else." She looked at the fire. "Thomas kept that land because it completed the property line." "That's still reason enough, even with the silver." "Especially with the silver," she said. "I don't want what's underneath it. I want the land." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "And the ranch generally," he said. "Your plans for it: expand the herd slowly. Samuel back as foreman. Hire 2 more hands in spring." She paused. "I've been talking to Margaret Hollis, which surprised me more than it surprised her, about establishing a small fund for widows in the county. Women who find themselves where I was 2 years ago. Not charity. Practical support. Help with legal documents, with understanding deeds and property rights, with the specific things nobody tells women they need to know until they desperately need to know them." Ethan looked at her. "Margaret Hollis agreed to that?" "Margaret Hollis," Clara said, "is a woman who backed the wrong understanding of me for 2 years and knows it. She is highly motivated to be useful now." "You're going to run her," Ethan said with something in his voice that was almost wonder. "I'm going to give her the opportunity to do something worthwhile with her organizational talents," Clara said precisely. "Which is different, is it?" "Somewhat," Clara said. He laughed, a real one, low and genuine, and she turned to look at him in the firelight, this man she had known for 4 months, and felt she understood in some ways better than people she'd known for decades. And the thing she'd been carrying since the courthouse steps settled into something she recognized as a decision. "She made it, Ethan," she said. "Yes, I spent 2 years believing that losing Thomas meant I had used up my portion," she said. "That whatever I'd been given, the love, the partnership, the feeling of being known by someone, that was my share, and it was gone, and I should be grateful I'd had it at all." She looked at the fire. "I don't believe that anymore." He was very still. "What do you believe?" he said. "I believe that being known by someone is not a finite resource that runs out," she said. "I believe that Thomas knew me, and that was real and complete, and I will carry it my whole life. And I believe," she stopped, made herself continue, "I believe that you see me, not the widow, not the landowner. Not the woman who built a federal case out of a saddle and a Bible page. Just me, Clara." She turned to look at him directly. "And I would like very much to stop pretending. That doesn't matter to me." The fire cracked and shifted. Ethan turned to face her fully. "Clara Bellamy," he said, "I have been in love with you since the morning you told me you would have figured out the fence post yourself." She stared at him. "That was the first week," she said. "Yes," he said. "You've known for 4 months. I've known for 4 months," he confirmed. "I was waiting for you to be ready. I was also," he added, with the slight quality of a man making an honest admission, "somewhat afraid of you." "You were afraid of me? You are a formidable woman," he said. "I had reason." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and took his hand, not dramatically, not with ceremony, just reached across the space between them and took his hand the way you take hold of something you've decided belongs in your keeping. His fingers closed around hers. They sat like that for a while, beside the fire, with Danny asleep against his saddle and the Montana night enormous and cold around them, and Clara felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not the filling of a gap. Thomas had left a gap that would always be shaped like him, and nothing would change that. But something new, alongside it its own shape, its own weight, belonging to now. She had not expected to find this. She was deeply quietly glad she had. They arrived back in Willow Creek on the second afternoon. And the town received them in the way that small frontier communities receive significant news immediately, and with the particular combination of practicality and emotional investment that characterized people who lived close enough to each other's lives to be genuinely affected by them. Elizabeth Crane met them at the edge of town, took one look at all four of them, and said to Danny, "You're thin. Come home." Danny went, with the air of a young man who had conducted himself with distinction and was not above being fed by his mother afterward. Joseph Crane came out of the mercantile to hear the verdict and shook Clara's hand with a firm grip, the expression of a man revising a 2-year assessment. Even Margaret Hollis, stationed, Clara suspected, specifically to intercept them, appeared on the boardwalk and said, "I've drafted the initial framework for the Widow's Fund. When you're ready to review it, I'm available." "Tomorrow afternoon," Clara said. Margaret nodded briskly, as though she had known the answer would be tomorrow and had already organized accordingly. Samuel Whitaker rode directly to the Bellamy Ranch and began assessing the new barn with the specific eye of a man who knew exactly where the tack room should go. Clara stood in the middle of Willow Creek's Main Street for a moment, looking at all of it, the town that had decided she was finished, reorganizing itself around the fact that she was not, and she felt something she couldn't quite name that was related to but distinct from satisfaction. It was the feeling of a story landing correctly, not the ending she would have written. She would have written Thomas alive and the ranch thriving, and none of the last 2 years necessary. But the story that existed, the one she had actually lived, had landed correctly, and there was a particular integrity in that which she was learning to recognize as its own kind of gift. Ethan appeared beside her. "Come look at something," he said. She followed him to the edge of the property, past the new barn frame with its good bones, and the repaired fence line and the north pasture, where the winter grass was going brown and beautiful. All the way to the original fence post, the one he'd diagnosed that first morning, the one she'd replaced with his timber, the one she'd stood at the day, everything changed. He stopped there. She stood beside him. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the Harmon place." "What about it?" "It's a good property," he said. "Good water access. South pasture drains well now, but it's 3 miles from here," which he paused. 3 miles is a long way. Clara looked at the fence post. "It is," she said. "I was thinking," he said carefully, "that the Bellamy Ranch could use a stronger western boundary, and that the Caldwell property and the Bellamy property share a line that, if the two operations were combined, would make one of the most complete ranch properties in the county." Clara was quiet for a moment. "That's a business proposition," she said. "It's the beginning of one," he said. "The rest of it is something else." He turned to face her, and she turned to face him, standing at the fence post where their story had started, in the late November light with the Rockies cold and clear in the distance. "I'm not a man who does this gracefully," he said. "I want you to know that going in. I say what I mean, and I don't always say it at the right time, and I have strong opinions about drainage systems and fence posts, and I will probably not stop having those opinions." "I have noticed," Clara said. "I love you," he said. "I want to build something with you, not take over what you've built. Not manage it or protect it or stand in front of it. Build something alongside it with you for as long as you'll have me." He paused. "Clara Bellamy, will you marry me?" Not performed as a question. Said as the thing it was, a decision offered to another person who had the full right to make her own. Clara looked at this man who had stopped at her fence and looked at her without pity and made her laugh for the first time in years, and stood beside her through a federal murder trial and held her hand beside. A fire, and was afraid of her and loved her anyway. She thought about Thomas, who had seen her when no one else was looking. She thought about what it meant to be seen. She thought about the woman she was now, not the woman grief had made her, not the woman the town had decided she was, but Clara Bellamy, who had rebuilt a barn and made a federal case and established a widow's fund and was standing at a fence post in November, knowing exactly what she wanted. Yes, she said. Not elaborately, not with caveats or conditions or the careful hedging of a woman who didn't trust her own judgment. Just yes, clean and certain, the way she said things she had fully decided. Ethan exhaled. Clara saw it, the release of something he'd been holding, and understood that he had been more afraid than he'd let on, and found that she loved him considerably more for it. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with 2 fingers, the gentlest gesture, and she leaned into it slightly, the way the bay mare leaned into a careful hand. With the trust of something that had been hurt before, and had decided to try again. "I should warn you," she said. "About what?" "I'm going to run this ranch exactly as I see fit," she said. "I'm going to establish the Widow's Fund, whether Margaret Hollis's framework is sensible or not. I'm going to take in Samuel as foreman and trust his judgment and override it when I disagree. I'm going to make decisions you think are wrong sometimes, and I'm going to expect you to tell me when you do." "I know," he said. "And I'm going to love you," she said, "in the particular way that I love things completely, and without much performance of it, and sometimes inconveniently." "That," Ethan said, "is exactly what I'm asking for." They married the following April, on the first genuinely warm day of the Montana spring, at the Bellamy Ranch, not in the church, because Clara had decided she wanted to be married on her own land, and Reverend Hollis, who had been doing a careful and ongoing revision of his opinions about Clara Bellamy since November, agreed without argument to perform the ceremony at the fence line. The fence post was still there. Clara had not replaced it again. She had let it stand exactly as it was, the timber Ethan had sent that first morning, still solid in the ground, and she had thought more than once that some things were worth keeping precisely because of where they'd come from. Samuel Whitaker stood at the back of the gathered crowd and held his hat in his hands and looked at the mountains. Danny Crane stood in the front row with his mother's hand on his shoulder and the expression of a young man witnessing something he intended to remember. Elizabeth Crane, standing beside her son, was not crying. She was Elizabeth Crane, but her jaw had a quality of determined steadiness that looked, to someone who knew what to look for, like the same thing. Margaret Hollis had organized the reception with characteristic precision. It was excellent. Ethan said his vows in the same untheatrical way. He said everything looking at Clara, meaning it, not performing the meaning, but simply having it, and letting that be sufficient. Clara said hers the same way. When it was done, Reverend Hollis pronounced them married, and someone in the gathered crowd made a noise of satisfaction that was more frontier than formal, and Ethan kissed her once, briefly, at the fence post, which was exactly right. They built the Bellamy Caldwell Ranch into one of the most respected operations in Montana Territory over the years that followed. Not the largest, not the wealthiest, but the one people pointed to when they talked about how a ranch could be run with honesty and practicality and the kind of fairness that came from people who understood what it cost to be treated as less than you were. The Widow's Fund became something real, 7 women in the first year, 14 in the second. Legal consultation and deed education and the specific practical knowledge that Clara had had to learn in crisis and had decided other women should have before they needed it. Margaret Hollis ran the organizational side with the focused energy of someone who had found the right use for her considerable talents, and Clara ran the rest, and they discovered, to neither of their complete surprise, that they worked very well together when they weren't trying to manage each other. Samuel rebuilt the tack room exactly as Thomas had had it. Clara walked in there sometimes alone and stood with the smell of cedar and leather and the specific organization of a careful man's mind, and she talked to Thomas the way she'd always talked to him directly, without ceremony. The way you talk to someone who knows you well enough that you don't need to explain yourself. She told him about the ranch, about Ethan. About the fund and Samuel and Danny Crane, who was 15 now and had decided to be a federal marshal and was writing to Arthur Dean for advice, which Dean was apparently providing with the seriousness of a man who recognized the good material. She told him that she was happy, that it was a different happiness than the one she'd had with him, its own shape, its own season, but that it was real and she was living it fully, and she thought he would be glad. She believed he would be. Thomas Bellamy had been a man who wanted the people he loved to live at full size. Not to survive, not to endure, to live with their whole selves, taking up the space they deserved, being seen by the world at their actual dimensions. Clara was living at full size, she had been all along. The only thing that had ever been required was that she stop accepting other people's smaller version of her. Years later, people in Willow Creek still told the story of how Ethan Caldwell had stopped at Clara Bellamy's fence. They told it the way frontier communities tell the stories that matter slightly different each time, the details shifting to fit the teller, but the center of it always the same. The widow at the fence, the stranger on the horse. The joke about the duel, and Clara Bellamy, who had been told she was too much and not enough simultaneously, who had buried a husband and a barn and 2 years of grief and come out the other side, holding a signed affidavit in a federal case and the absolute unshakable knowledge of her own worth. Clara Bellamy, who had laughed, that first real laugh, and pressed her hand to her mouth like she could take it back. She never took it back. Not the laugh, not the land, not the love, not 1 inch of the life she had decided, at a broken fence post on a Tuesday morning in Montana, that she deserved. The greatest thing Clara Bellamy ever did was not build the case that brought Garrett to justice, though she did that. It was not the Widow's Fund, though it changed lives. It was not even the way she loved Ethan Caldwell steadily, honestly, without performance. The greatest thing Clara Bellamy ever did was refuse to be finished. And she did it every single day, for the rest of her long and full and utterly her own life.